Hey, Panthers. All right. Today, A pushers, we're going to bring in more colonies. We're going to get more English to show up. Even though the English said for a long time they weren't interested in the New World, as soon as they get here, boy, they just don't stop coming over. So today, we're going to get more English showing up and see even more that the English begin to see the New World uh, as a possible way to solve a lot of their internal problems back in England. Today, we're going to get some new colonies. These colonies are going to be set up for entirely different reasons than Virginia. Virginia is set up primarily for one reason and one reason only, and that's to make money for England. It's a business venture. It's a private business venture. Virginia start is how Virginia starts out. These colonies are going to be created for entirely different reasons. They're not a private business venture. Now, certainly, part of the deal for their coming here is that they've got to make money for the crown, but that's not their primary reason. They're coming here for entirely different reasons. So, let's go. First off, we're going to finish up with Jamestown here. Talk a little bit more about Jamestown. Jamestown has begun to stabilize. They've figured out how to make money, and they're making a lot of money for England, for the Crown, and for the Virginia Company. And that's by tobacco. England loves tobacco, Europe loves tobacco, and Virginia's got a lot of it. But as they begin to stabilize and their population begins to grow, they begin to get new problems, primarily with their indentured servants. So here's what's happening. Remember, the indentured servants are basically contracted slave labor. And these mostly young men come over from England, from the poorhouses and debtors' prisons and so on. And they come over here for a fresh start to serve as an apprentice, but really it's as a slave to a master craftsman or an artisan. And they'll hopefully learn the skill. And then at the end of 5 years, they're released from their contract. However, nobody seemed to stop and think about, what do we do with these indentured servants at the end of their contract? So there was no plan for them. So at the end of their contract, they're just free and they have nowhere to go. They don't get any land. They don't have anything at all to do. So these young, mostly men, males, begin to do what young men tend to do when there's not a lot to do, and that's do stupid things. So they begin to drink, they begin to fight, they begin to gamble. They just generally become a nuisance and a real problem in the town because there's nothing for them to do and there's nowhere for them to go. They're basically stuck here and they're just as homeless as they were in England. So in 1618, the leaders in Jamestown write a letter to the king saying, dude, we've got some real serious problems here in Jamestown and we need some help. So they said indentured servants at the end of their contract should get their own land. So they have something to do and they have somewhere to go. And they're not going to be these young hoodlums roaming around the town causing problems. Give them their own land. We should give them their own land so they can start their lives and become a member of the community. And let's be honest, we're Englishmen. We're from England. We are part of you. Just because we don't happen to live in England at this point in time, we have the same rights as Englishmen. And we needed to be treated like Englishmen. And we don't feel like really we are. We feel like we're not being treated equally the same as people back in England are being treated. So we just want to have our rights recognized. We want our own local branch of government here to help us solve some of these problems, because here's one of the big problems. If there was something happening in Jamestown that needed to be addressed or needed to be fixed, the people in Jamestown have to write a letter to the king and then send it over to England, which is 6 weeks to 2 months trip to get to England. And then it gets to the king, and the king can read the letter, and he might have to go to Parliament. Hopefully, Parliament's in session at that time to get an answer. Then he can write. Then he writes his answer, and he's got to ship it back to the people of Jamestown. All of this could take 4 to 6 months total for all of these things to happen. In that period of time, the problem may no longer exist. It may have kind of gone away, or the problem may have gotten a lot worse. So the people in Jamestown say we need our own branch of government so we can deal with some of these issues and fix these issues and address these issues on our own immediately. King James responds in 1619, and King James goes, "You're right." He allows land to be given to indentured servants so they're not roaming the town as drunken fools causing problems. And he allows for the creation of a local elected government where the people of Jamestown are going to choose their own people to serve as leaders in a government within the settlement of Jamestown. And it's called the House of Burgesses. Still today, the legislature in the state of Virginia is called the House of Burgesses. And this was just a local government that allowed them to address and take care of problems on their own without having to deal with going back and forth in England. Yay! And now some of the other problems. Remember, there's a religious war almost taking place in England between all of these different groups who are fighting for the soul of England. In particular, there's the Puritans. The two biggest problems are the Puritans. Remember, they like the Church of England. They like the idea of a church separate from uh, the Catholic Church. They like their own church centered in England. They like that, but they want to purify it. They want to get rid of what they call the popishness. They want to get rid of the influences of the Catholic Church. So it's just a very simple, easy to follow, easy to understand Church of England. And then there's the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims believed that the Church of England was too popish, that it couldn't be purified, that it was so much, it was so close to being the Catholic Church that it could never be purified, that they had to like burn it all down and start over with a completely different church. The Church of England is basically the Diet Catholic Church, close but not quite. The Pilgrims want a completely different church. They're separatists. They want a separate church, and they want it to be just very, very simple, exactly the way the Bible says you should worship God. That's what they want. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims are in this conflict with each other. Puritans like the Church of England. They just want to purify it. They want it simpler. Pilgrims want an entirely new church. Pilgrims don't like Puritans. Nobody liked the Pilgrims. Nobody likes the Pilgrims. The Catholics don't like Pilgrims. The Puritans don't like Pilgrims. The Anglicans don't like Pilgrims. Nobody in England likes Pilgrims. Pilgrims are as low as you can possibly go in English society. Nobody likes the Pilgrims, and they're treated extraordinarily poorly in England. So, Pilgrims, to escape persecution and the prejudice, and to be able to practice their religion as they want, they go to the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands is by far the most liberal, the most open, the most oh, the most forgiving country in Europe. The Netherlands is like a big giant boulder. Everybody gets along. We're all super happy. We don't hate anybody. Everybody's good. We're just going to live life and have a good time. So the Pilgrims go to the Netherlands because they'll be left alone, they'll be treated well, and they can worship the way they want to. However, there's a problem living in the Netherlands. Although they don't want to live in England, they still want to be English. And the big problem was with their children. Their children were growing up Dutch. Their children were acting like Dutch. They were thinking like the Dutch. They were much more Dutch in their way of life and their view of the world than they were English. And this was a big no no for the Pilgrims. We can live in the Netherlands, but we're not going to act like the Dutch. That's out of the question. So they begin to try to figure out how can we remain English but practice our religion without being persecuted and prejudiced. So in 1620, they decide, you know what we can do? We can go to the New World. We can live in the English colony of Virginia, so we'll still live under English rule and with English customs and English culture, but we'll be away from England and we can still be pilgrims. It's the best of everything. So they decide to do this in 1620. Now there's a problem. This is a really expensive trip. It's a really expensive trip. You got to pay for the ship. You got to rent a ship to go over there. You've got to pay for the food. You've got to pay the crew to take you over there. So a lot of expenses here. And the pilgrims just don't have a lot of money. They don't have that kind of money. So to help pay for the trip, they begin to advertise all over England for people who are not necessarily pilgrims, but want to get out of England and have a fresh start and a new adventure and a new lease on life, to join them and help pay for the trip. So they advertise all over London and all around England, encouraging anybody who wants to join them to help to go and help pay for the trip. So there's a number of people who agree to this. They're not pilgrims. They probably really don't care about the pilgrims' religion, but whatever. As long as they can get out of England, they're fine. So they help pay for the trip. Now, these people who are not pilgrims, but they're just going with the pilgrims to live in in the new world with a new lease on life, the pilgrims call these people the others. They never give them any other name. They just call them the others. So 1620, they leave England. They've got two ships, the Mayflower and the Godspeed. And both of them are packed full of people. There's hardly any room for them to move around on these two ships. As they begin to leave England, they begin to realize the Godspeed was not the Godspeed. The Godspeed was taking on water and was sinking. So they had to turn around and go back to England, and hopefully they'd make it back to England before the Godspeed completely sunk. They do. They get back to England before the Godspeed completely sinks. And now they've got to unload all of these people from the Godspeed and cram them into the already crowded Mayflower. And they take off to the New World. Now, originally, their plan was to land in Virginia, just outside of Jamestown, and create their own settlement in Virginia. That's where the English law was. That's where the English culture was. That's where England was. They were going to live in Virginia, and they got the Crown's blessing to set up a settlement in Virginia. They get to Virginia in November, and there's a very bad storm in Virginia, and um, they can't land. So the captain of the Mayflower says, I've made this trip before, and I know if we go a little further north, there's an arm of land that juts out into the ocean that we can go around and go inside that arm of land. And the water there, because it's protected on three sides by land, the water there is fairly calm, and we might be able to land there, even if the storm is here. Even if the storm reaches that far north, the water here should be calm. So that's what they do. They go north to this arm of land that juts out into the ocean. They come around, and sure enough, the water is calm in this body of water inside this little bay here. As they begin to make preparations to go ashore, the strangers begin crazy talk. The strangers begin to say things that scare the bejesus out of the pilgrims. The strangers begin to say things like, this is not Virginia, and it's not in English territory, so we don't need to follow English law. We can do whatever we want. There are no rules and there are no laws in this place that we're about to go. Well, this is crazy talk to the pilgrims. The pilgrims are all about order and all about law and all about following the rules, and nobody ever steps outside of that. Well, this scares the bejesus out of the pilgrims now that people are talking crazy talk about not following any rules. So before they get off the ship, the pilgrims have a meeting and they sign a contract. They create a contract which basically says everybody is going to follow English law. Even though this is not technically Virginia and it's not technically England, English rules and English law applies here. And everybody's going to follow it. And everybody's going to agree to this. And then they bring in the others and they tell the others, you've got two choices. You can sign this contract, which you promise you will follow the laws, or you can get off the ship without a boat. Just walk off the edge into the ocean because you're not coming ashore with us. So the strangers, just the men, right? No women. Women don't sign contracts. That's crazy talk. Women don't do those things. So all of the men are forced to sign this contract stating that they will follow English law and they will follow the rules of the community. This is known as the Mayflower Compact. Now, this is important because this is the first kind of written law, written form of government, or written set of laws in the New World. And everybody's forced to sign it before they get off the boat. And it's called the Mayflower Compact, and it's to control the strangers. So they get off, and they go to the new land, and they land in November of 1620. And we all know what happens, right? They land at this place. There's a rock that they land on, and the leader, John Bradford, gets off of the boat, the little rowboat, and he puts one foot on this rock, and he said, this is where we will make our settlement, and this is where we will make our way. This is Plymouth. We shall call this settlement Plymouth. And to mark the occasion, they chisel the date into the rock, 1620. And there it is. There's a picture of that rock that the pilgrims chiseled the date into as they got off the boat. And it's there today. If you go to Plymouth, Massachusetts, you can pay, I think it's $5 last time I was there, and you go down to the beach, and basically in this cage is this rock, and you look down at it and you go, look, there's Plymouth Rock. And there's the date chiseled into it. Except it's all wrong. This is not true at all. Think about this. If you're in a wooden rowboat and you're going to the shore, would you aim your wooden rowboat at a rock? Of course you wouldn't. Rocks do bad things to wooden boats. And if you're landing in some new territory that you know nothing about, and out in the woods are natives and wild animals and beasts and things that you know nothing about, and you have to figure out a way to live here, is your first thought going to be, boy, we should really chisel the date into this rock? Of course not. This is a completely, totally made up story. Here's how we get it. During the Great Depression, tourism is down, and Plymouth is looking for a way to bring tourists into Plymouth to come see the first pilgrim settlement. And while they're trying to figure out a way to attract tourists during the Great Depression, they tear down a house, an old house down by the beach. And as they tear down the house, underneath the porch, the front porch of this house, was this gigantic rock, was this big rock. And somebody from the town Chamber of Commerce goes, that could be the rock that the pilgrims stepped on when they came into Plymouth in 1620. And somebody else says, well, I think you're right. That could be the rock. Nobody can say otherwise, right? Nobody can say there wasn't this rock. So they brought in this town, I don't know what you call him, stonesmith, let's say, and he chiseled into the rock 1620. And then the Chamber of Commerce put this cage around it and began advertising, come see the Plymouth Rock that the pilgrims stepped on when they first arrived in Plymouth. And they charged $5 or whatever they charged at that time. And it worked. And tourists still today go to see this rock, pay $5 to look at this rock that is completely, totally false. Huh. So in 1629, Puritans, the other religious group, show up. And they arrive just north of where the pilgrims landed. The pilgrims are down in here. They've created Plymouth. The Puritans are going to land just a little further north, and they come here for the exact same reasons. They're being persecuted and they're prejudiced and just think life is not good for them in England, so they're coming here to escape England so they can practice their religion as they see fit. Their first settlement is a town called Salem, which is right there. 1630, John Winthrop, who was he's a Puritan preacher, and you guys hopefully have read Model of Christian Charity. This is one of his famous sermons. In 1630, John Winthrop arrives with the Royal Charter. It's a piece of paper recognizing this as a legitimate, real colony of England, and he calls it Massachusetts. Boston is founded as the capital of this colony. The government is going to be a theocracy, so it's going to be a government run by the religion. It's going to be based off of the religious beliefs of the Puritans. Puritans also believe that the natives in the woods surrounding them are obviously subhuman. Look at how they live. Look at what they worship. Look at what they do. They're obviously subhumans, and they're an abomination against God. They are an insult to the glory of God, and therefore they must be eliminated. And the Puritans begin to embark on a genocidal crusade against the natives in the area. Eventually, Massachusetts and Plymouth will merge and become just one colony, the Massachusetts colony. Oh, you guys can tell I'm recording this during the end of school. They merge and they create one colony. And it just becomes a Massachusetts colony. Eventually, the Puritans and the Pilgrims are able to put aside their religious differences, and the Pilgrims basically fade away, and they all become Puritans. All right. Now things begin to get tricky for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1632, there's a guy that arrives from England. His name is Roger Williams. Check out Roger Williams there, sporting the cool mustache. And Roger Williams shows up, and he kind of pays attention and looks at how things are going in Massachusetts, and he decides, this ain't right. There's some really uncool things happening here. He doesn't like religion and government being intermingled. Now, Roger Williams, he certainly is a religious person. He certainly believes in God and certainly is a Puritan himself, but he doesn't believe that religion and government should be mixed. He thinks that religion is too pure and too good to be mixed up with things like government, which is nasty and dirty and not good. And he doesn't think that's right. So he begins to question that. And he also questions how come they're just taking land from the natives. He says, well, gosh, this land that Boston and Salem are on, we paid the Indians for it, right? And the people in Boston and Salem go, no, we just took it. And Roger Williams says, well, that's not right. We couldn't do that in England. You just couldn't show up in somebody's front yard and say, well, we're going to take your property. We couldn't do that. So why would we do that here? Because this is not the way things would go on in England. And so he says, we need to treat the natives better. They're humans just like us. Just because they look different, act different, doesn't mean that they're subhuman. Doesn't mean that they're not human. It just means that they're different. And we can't be taking things and killing them. So these questions about religion and government and how we treat the natives, those things don't sit well with the people in Massachusetts. The colony tells Williams, look, dude, you got to quit talking. You got to quit causing problems. You're a troublemaker. You need to cut it out or you need to leave. Well, Williams doesn't stop. And worst of all, he's beginning to have people around the colony go, yeah, I think Roger Williams is right. I don't think government should be involved in religion. And I don't think religion should be setting the rules for government. And I don't think we should be treating the natives the way that we treat them. Roger Williams is right. Well, this is very troubling to the Puritans, who, like the Pilgrims, like law and order, and everybody's got to do exactly what we expect you to do because you can't step outside of the box. So, in 1636, Roger Williams and his followers are kicked out of Massachusetts. They're just too crazy to deal with. So, we go down the coast a little ways, and Roger Williams founds his own settlement that he calls Providence. They don't intermingle religion and government, and they're going to deal better with the Indians. So he sets up his own settlement, his own colony that he calls Providence. Now, if Massachusetts thought Roger Williams was a big troublemaker and Roger Williams was really, really like crazy and hard to deal with, who they get next? This is really going to test the Massachusetts people. It's a woman. Oh, a woman is going to cause problems. Her name is Anne Hutchinson, and she lives in Boston. And after a while, Anne stops going to church. Now, this is something Puritans would definitely notice. If you don't show up in church, they notice. And there's only a couple of reasons why you wouldn't go to church. One, you're like deathly ill. Or two, you're a devil worshiper. Those are the only two reasons why you wouldn't go to church. So people in Boston notice, I wonder where Anne is. She hadn't been in church for a couple of weeks. So they ask Anne, why haven't you been in church? And she goes, I don't want to go. What do you mean you don't want to go? You got to go. You go to church. She said, what for? Because that's where you talk to God. That's God's house. You go there and talk to God. That's why you go. And she goes, well, God's all knowing, right? Well, of course he is. God's all powerful. Yes, of course. God knows and sees everything. Yes, of course. That's why you go to talk to him. She said, well, if he knows and sees everything, then how come I can't talk to him from my house? What? What do you mean talk to him from? You talk from church. She said, well, if he's as powerful and as all knowing and as great as we all know he is, then why can he only hear us when we're in a church? Why can't I pray to him and talk to him from my house? What? What is wrong with you? So it's obvious she's a witch, right? That's the only thing she is. She's a witch, and she's a real problem. So they put Anne Hutchinson on trial for being a witch. So the way that they would do these trials there are a couple of different ways. The way that they do it with her is they're going to bring in Puritan ministers who are going to question Anne Hutchinson on the Bible. The belief is that since the Bible is the Word of God, people who are witches or devil worshippers, they can't touch the Bible because it's the Word of God, so it'll burn them. So they could never touch the Bible and open it. And if they happen to come across a Bible that was open, all that they would see is a blank page because they're devil worshippers and they're witches. So they couldn't see the Word of God. So it would just be a blank page. So they bring her in, put her on trial, and begin asking her questions about the Bible to prove that she is a witch. And as it turns out, Anne Hutchinson knows the Bible better than the Puritan ministers. Puritan ministers would ask her in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 4. What does it mean when it says da 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 da? And Anne Hutchinson will say, well, you said it wrong, because that's not what it says. So she would challenge the Puritan ministers in church, saying that their knowledge of the Bible wasn't correct. Well, they would go back to check to just prove Anne Hutchinson was wrong. And they would find out she was right. Anne Hutchinson knows the Bible better than the Puritan ministers did. So it's obvious she's not a witch, but she's still a woman. And she's still causing problems because she's not following the rules. And she's got people in Massachusetts who agree with her, which is another huge problem because it's more people who are challenging the rules. So they kick Anne Hutchinson and her family and her followers out. They're kicked out of Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson goes down the road a little ways and she founds her own settlement with her family and her people that she calls Portsmouth. And it's not far away from Roger Williams. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson eventually combine their two settlements, and they receive a charter, meaning that England's going to recognize them as a legitimate independent colony in a new world called Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is going to create a constitution of sorts, and it's called the frame of government. And its one guiding principle is very simple: separation of church and state. You are free to believe what you want to believe as long as it's not something crazy like witchcraft or atheism or something like that, right? As long as you're a Christian, believe what you want to believe. But the religion, the church, and the state will never mix with each other. They will be completely, totally separate. In 1636, a follower of Roger Williams, Thomas Hooker, he's a minister. He gets kind of frustrated with Roger Williams, the way Roger Williams is running things. And so he leaves, takes some people with him, goes down a ways, creates his own colony of Connecticut. And that's about all for Connecticut. His outline of government is called the Fundamental Orders. It's also a separation of church and state. In 1629, settlers from England looking for a new start, they arrive in a new world. They have a charter from the King of England to set up their own colony. They settle just north of Massachusetts, and they create a colony that they call in honor of where they came from in England. They came from a place in England known as Hampshire. They call this in honor of where they came from, New Hampshire. And now we've got Virginia. And then we have a big leap up to Massachusetts. We have Rhode Island, and we have Connecticut, and we have New Hampshire. These colonies up here are founded mostly for religious reasons. They're here to escape religious persecution and practice their religion as they see fit. Now, they are required to make money, right? They can't just hang out here and worship God. how they want. They've also got to do things to make money for the church. And then we've got Virginia down in here, which is a private company, and their one purpose is to make money for the king. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 13 colonies established. And we'll stop there. And then next time, we'll make even more colonies with even more people with even different reasons for coming here. Until next time, Panthers, take care.